Very warm welcome to FSC Connect on Friday morning, the 22nd of May. Absolutely delighted to have such a great lineup of colleagues from near and far. And this session is really focused on the financial services sector locally, regionally and globally, and some of the things that have been happening in New Zealand, Australia and around the world. We have Tim Grafton, who's the CEO of the Insurance Council of New Zealand and also sits on the executive board of the Global Federation of Insurance Associations, or GIFIA. So welcome, Tim. We are also delighted to have Sally Lone, who is the CEO of the Financial Services Council of Australia. We work really closely with the FSC across the ditch, and a very warm welcome to Sally. In my top right-hand corner, we have Phil Kewen, who is the CEO of the Association of Financial Advisors. He has the best branding of all of us, and he runs the Advisor Association in Australia. And again, we work closely with our colleagues across the ditch. And finally, but not last, is Vanessa Stoichkov. Vanessa is a commentator, a founder, a speaker, and an observer of the Australian financial services sector now over many, many years, and will bring a really interesting perspective to this discussion. And what we thought we would do to start off with is probably to ask the question to each of our panelists about what's keeping them up at night. So Sally, maybe if I go to you first for your view on how's it been over the last couple of months in particular, and how have you and your members responded?
Thanks, Richard, and good morning to everyone. It's great to be on this panel, and we, of course, have been in touch regularly with Richard because being two countries quite similar with islands, island countries, obviously, who moved very quickly before the rest of the world, I think, and that's why I think Australia and New Zealand have done particularly well dealing with the health crisis. Look, I think the thing, Richard, that keeps me up at night is the economic crisis that's looming. That is the big, clear and present danger to everyone in Australia. We have a massive job keeper and job seeker program, which of course government taxpayer funded, $130 billion plus already. It's going to end in September. But that we don't expect now to have an economic snapback as we thought might happen. I think this is going to be quite long and slow. The Secretary of the Treasury in Australia yesterday said, look, the recession word may not be the word that I'd use. So, there's not a lot of optimism. I think on the other side, there is, I'm always a glass half full person, so I do like to think about opportunities. I think what we've all seen is this massive sort of time-lapse video of the way we've all embraced technology and a different way of working. And that's opened up enormous numbers of opportunities and different ways of thinking about how we deliver, particularly financial services. And I'm sure we've all been in touch with our financial advisors during this time just to check on our superannuation, whether we're making the right decisions. I had a couple of, personal things that happened in my life during this lockdown. I had to put my mother into aged care, so that opened up a whole new world of aged care financial advice that I got into, and then I had to sell assets during the COVID lockdown, and that has been extraordinary. And I changed my own manager for my own self-managed super fund. So that, again, I was in the middle of all of this. So I've lived it pretty close, that whole advice world. And I tell you what, having good advisors, specialist advisors during this time in particular has been fantastic for my own, I guess, peace of mind, and that's what a lot of Australian advisors are delivering right now. At the FSC in Australia, our members are fund managers, obviously the people who are trying to keep the wealth, the value of the wealth, Australians' wealth and retirement savings. We have superannuation funds as members. We have advice licensee companies, and we have life insurers. And we've done a lot in life insurance, particularly as the health crisis has rolled out. So an enormous amount of work, obviously just triaging our own small business, our own organisation, our own staff, as everybody has been, but then pivoting very, very quickly to engage all of our regulators. We had to move very quickly because there was an enormous amount of post-Royal Commission work that was happening, all the new legislation, regulations that were coming through. What we did for our members immediately was essentially go to the regulators and say, we want this list of things deferred. We cannot, nobody has the bandwidth to achieve this major regulatory timetable now. Luckily, the regulators reacted, the government reacted, and we've had a number of deferrals, as I think has happened in New Zealand as well. So that's been very welcome. Everybody's still working very, very hard on delivering customer service. That's at the forefront of our members' minds at the moment. And I'll pause there.
That's awesome. Thanks, Sally. And we're going to come back and explore some of those themes because I think, yeah, there's some pretty key learnings. Tim, can I go to you for your sense of what's kept you up at night over the last 6-8 weeks?
Sure. Thanks, Richard. Tēnā koutou katoa. So I'd echo the comments that Sally's just made, so I'll try to avoid repeating that because I think much the same level of concern rests over here about how the things will play out with respect to the recession. Over the last 2 months, we were, I think, fortunate that we acted early. We actually did a BCP plan about 3 or 4 weeks before we went into lockdown, and we did it on COVID-19. So we were well prepared and went into lockdown before the government ordered lockdown. And that prepared us well to be able to respond. What we've done is looked at things through probably about half a dozen lenses. First of all, customer outcomes. How is this going to play out? That flowed on to sector reputational impact, and then we were looking at how claims were developing either up or down, regulatory government responses, liquidity and solvency issues for all those in our sector as well as more broadly across the economy, and then the operational effectiveness of the sector and ourselves. And on that last bit, I think the sector has played out really well in terms of transferring work from home and work remotely, and obviously I think that has implications and learnings for the future. We also acted early in terms of agreeing across our membership 10 principles as to the way in which we would respond to customers in financial hardship, to suppliers in terms of payments and prompt payments, and also to support our distribution networks and our brokers. So that played out in terms of how each individual member would implement that, but those principles enabled us to engage with government and the regulators to advise them that actually, contrary to how the playbook was looking 12 months ago, this sector has moved and treats customers with the utmost priority in terms of looking after them when the chips are down. And I think our conduct has, validated what I've always believed that this sector does in terms of its customer support. And I think regulators have now recognised that when the chips are down, we are there for our customers and to support this economy and through the recovery phase as well. And I think that has also brought us closer together with regulators. I think regulators now have responded, and they responded early by pushing back on the huge regulatory pipeline that was before us and deferring things, as you referred to earlier, Richard, for 12 months, 6 months on some other programs as well. So I think there's been a coming together and a common understanding. I think the fundamental issue going forward is how deep is this recession going to be? To what extent can insurers continue to support those in financial hardship whilst also balancing their own solvency concerns and obligations to all their policy holders? So fortunately, we've got good solvency buffers to be able to leverage that level of support, but depending on how deep this recession goes, we also have to maintain solvency and obligations to all policyholders. And this happens to be a country that has seen some huge claims come through in the last few years, and we have to be prepared for those sorts of events.
Thanks, Tim. Again, we'll explore some of those themes and also come to the global lens in a moment. Folks on the end of the line, this is interactive as you'd like it to be. At the bottom of your Zoom bar is a Q&A button. Feel free, if you got any questions or observations, to send them through. The more engaged and the more the questions, the better this panel can kind of pivot around and deal to the questions that are coming through. But for the moment, we're going to stay on track. And Phil, can we go to you for a response to that same question about what's kept you up at night for the last couple of months?
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be part of this panel. The first thing I'd say what kept me up at night was we had a massive storm overnight. So sorry if my eyes are hanging out. It was quite disrupting. But look, I guess I'll take a bit of a different lens. I mean, I represent the Association of Financial Advisors, so we have over 4,000 members of the 25,000 average advisors in Australia. Most of our members are small business operators. They might have between 2, 3 or 30 staff. And so I'll look at it through the lens of those advisors. It's worthwhile touching on the history in the fact that we have been going through tremendous change within the realms of financial advice, as Sally alluded to. We already had regulatory change. I know you've talked about some changes in New Zealand and being put back, and a FOFA, I think, was supposed to come into effect on the 1st of July. But we've had a lot of regulatory change. We then had a Royal Commission, which then layered on further regulatory change. And then we had the bushfire crisis at the end of last year, which put a lot of strain on people in different ways. Now, as Sally touched on, overall in Australia, we've had a very strong government response. We've had a number of stimulus packages that have helped the economy and that have helped small businesses. And what we have seen is it really has shown, as Sally said, the value of advice and the value that people place on financial advisors. But it does bring back to the fore the fact that many advisors have been extremely busy. They've been talking to their clients, and we'll unpack some of the activity that they've been undertaking there. But my biggest concern is the longer effect, and that is the mental health of not only advisors, but advisors of a snapshot of the broader community. I think we've seen a lot of support, and similar to what we saw with the bushfires, there's a lot of support, a lot of outpouring, a lot of recognition. But the longer this goes on, the fact that we haven't been able to socialise, the fact that we're in an industry that's a people industry where people are actually being used to being together, whether it's being face to face with clients or whether it's joining with colleagues, not having that opportunity to be together. I'm very concerned about, I guess, the silent group of advisors, of small business operators out there, having to adapt to different ways of doing things, not being able to see their colleagues, their clients face to face. We can talk about some great innovations and the way people have adapted, but it's also leaving some people behind with the mountain of change, mountain of regulatory change, and now having to do things differently. I am concerned about the mental health of a lot of our members, and as I said, as a snapshot of the broader community.
Thanks, Phil, and great perspective. And yeah, that whole resilience, mental health conversation we'll come to in a moment. Also mindful, I should say, to the people out there that our Australian colleagues are 2 hours behind. So it is 8 in the morning. So we absolutely appreciate them getting up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to join us. And so lastly, to Vanessa Stoichkov, V, as an observer and a commentator and a long-term participant in the Australian sector and the global sector, what's your observations of how things are going and what's been keeping you up at night?
Thanks, Richard. And who wouldn't get up for you across the ditch, New Zealand? We do love you. Look, it's been the perfect storm. In one sense, I work with advisors through the No More Practice platform, which has 16,000 advisors on it. And we've seen, a 30% increase in advisors just looking for information. And that's about, the government's sort of telling us we have to increase education standards and all the things that they're doing to actually be compliant in the future from the Royal Commission, as well as they've never been busier. We've got 1 million people in real numbers unemployed here in Australia. And in the last 12 months, we've had 5,000 advisors leave the industry as a result of education standards and Royal Commission and people retiring early because of it. So when you have more people than ever before needing advice, less advisors than we've ever had, super funds in turmoil really because of the early release scheme. And I know Sally and I have had some chats about this. You know, people are desperate here for money in some sectors like hospitality and retail, and there's just been closed down and people just don't have any income. So the 10,000 that they're able to withdraw before July and another 10,000 from their super fund after July could be the difference between people paying their rent, eating, you know, paying for their kids. So it's critically important, but it's had super funds scrambling to deliver because they've had thousands of calls. OneView, who administers a lot of super funds and owns the platform, said they've seen an 88% increase in calls to their call centres for managing super funds. So we've got engagement that we've never seen before with super funds having their staff work remotely because of COVID and dealing with 3 times the business and volume that they've ever had. So there's a lot of scrambling, there's a lot of stress. The leaders in businesses are exhausted. I talk to a lot of CEOs in funds management, in admin and platforms, because they're having to manage staff off-site. And there's a lot of mental health concerns, as Phil said, with that, of people actually just being at home all the time. I don't know, when you've got kids, there's definitely mental health concerns. I have 3 sons, but that's a whole nother story about just everyone being in the same house all the time. And that's tough. But at the end of the day, so much change from pandemic, topped with so much change from Royal Commission, topped with a whole bunch of Australians who never expected to be out of work, ever, now desperate. I mean, Sally's point about what's going to happen with in October when these JobKeeper and Seeker payments end, I worry about that. That's what keeps me up at night. I'm an advocate for the regular person. I'm trying to educate people about money. I believe advisors are the best way to do that. There's just not enough advisors here, and they are under enormous stress. I mean, business costs for them. It's very hard for advisors to make money when it costs between 3 and 11 grand to open a client file because of the administration burden. So in a nutshell, hoping not to be Dr. Doom, but there's a lot going on and a lot to be concerned about.
So that's a pretty confronting lens. Interestingly, both in Australia and New Zealand, it feels like the health crisis, which of course, if we were in a different country, perhaps our comments would be much more about the nature of the pandemic, the toll of people dying, everyone being seriously touched. Just picking that issue up for a moment, is it fair to say in Australia that just on the health front, it feels like it's like in New Zealand, in as much control as you could possibly get when you've got a pandemic you don't know a whole lot about? Perhaps, Sally, I'll go to you on that one.
Absolutely, Richard. Yes. I was one of those lucky people who went overseas in late February, early March, came back, put myself in isolation for 2 weeks, and I really haven't been out of it. So I think Australia and New Zealand handled it very, very well. Our leaders were really quick to close our borders. We were very, very quick to close our borders immediately from China, and I think Iran and Italy, which were the countries back then, wasn't so long ago. But I think our countries have dealt with it extremely well. We've only got to look at the rates of infection. We have absolutely flattened and squashed the curve. You made a point earlier about Australian states. We do have a federal constitution, of course, but the states, we do have state premiers who are saying, no, our borders are still closed. That's causing quite a bit of frustration from the businesses, particularly businesses on the Gold Coast in Queensland, where you need borders opening all the time. That's going to be really critical to getting the economy back on its feet, allowing people to travel. There's a pent-up demand for travel. People want to get out and visit places. So the state premiers are really going to have to think hard about that. Tasmania is still shut off as well. I can understand people being scared about the health issues, but we didn't have the devastation that we've seen across the world. The modelling suggested we would, so everybody was panicking about that, and rightly so. We got ourselves prepared, we got PPE, we got ventilators, all of that thing. Thank heavens nothing like that has happened. I think in Australia we've had 100 people die tragically. I think at the moment we've only got probably a few dozen in ICU, so it's been very limited. Like New Zealand, we've managed the health issues extremely well.
I think your point though, Sally, the one big difference is Australia having the state and federal model has created unnecessary confusion
Yes.
across borders. We've got a federal government that said, you know, it's safe to go to school. And you've got some states saying, yes, it is, no, it isn't. Oh, you can only go to school 1 day a week, and has created a lot more confusion. I do agree. I think we've handled it extremely well. There has been a lot of mixed messages along the way. But in terms of, I know Australia's been talking about flattening the curve. New Zealand's been talking about eradicating the virus. I think we've both done an excellent job. I think the key thing for us now is how we balance that coming back to normality with ensuring that we keep measures in place to keep the incidents down, but at the same time we bring the economy and society back to a level that we can actually work productively and create a productive and socially interactive economy.
Just a question to the Australians first, and Tim, I'll come to you on the same question. How important has the political leadership blended with the health leadership been in terms of getting a clear message to the community about what to do, what not to do? How's that played out in Australia, notwithstanding that state-federal conversation? And Tim, I'll then come to you for the same on the New Zealand version. Perhaps, Sally, if I start with you, and V, I'll go to you next.
Well, the government was really clear that they were taking their messages from the Chief Health Medical Officers, the CMO, and I think that's played really well. The CMO is the expert, and he's backed by a team of public health experts. The government then takes its lead from the CMO, and that is meant to work on a national cabinet level. So all the state premiers come together. They're advised by their CMOs, who are advised by the lead CMO. So it's meant to work very, very seamlessly. I think as Phil said, there's been, some confusion. I do think that was probably played up a little bit more than what was actually happening. I was very clear. I wasn't confused. I understood the messages coming down. I used to be a journalist. I understand how the media works. You've got to create, a sense of there's things happening that are going wrong all the time. But I actually give the governments, state and federal, and the CMOs a very good mark on how it's done. There are a few glitches along the way, but goodness me, when you look at us compared to other countries across the world, I think we get a 9 out of 10.
Thanks, Sally. V?
Well, I think one of the happy unintended consequences of this pandemic is that Australians feel proud to be Australian again. And there is love and affection for our government. And we had the devastating bushfires only in January, and it was quite embarrassing to be an Australian when you saw the world view of how we've treated climate. And I think there's been a hell of a lot of people that have been angry at our government for that. And I don't know, it takes a pandemic to divert our attention, but the economic reality is that the government has stepped in with a stimulus that's been quite generous. And, while people are suffering, it's certainly buffering the economy at the moment. And to be fair to Scott Morrison, and, I'm in the business of communication, he's been on the front foot. Honestly, he must be working day and night. That would be the worst job ever, I think. But he has been on the front foot communicating. I think he learnt from the mistakes of the bushfires. He's not going on holidays again, not that he could travel anyway. But the government's response has been excellent. And, us flattening the curve, people are proud of that. People are proud that we've all gotten together and said, this isn't going to happen here. And you see what's happening in the States and people rioting and Trump telling people to inject disinfectant. Like, it couldn't get worse from a leadership perspective overseas. And we've had really sensible governance and people coming together. So, Aussies and New Zealand in a crisis, I think we're pretty good. And I think people are proud to be Australian again and proud to live in this country. And that's a good consequence.
Thanks, V. Tim?
I think much the same here. Government, the outcomes are good in terms of where we're at in controlling it. A lot of big questions, though, still untested. And whilst New Zealanders are, I think, proud of what the government's achieved, the road ahead, and there's a long road ahead, is going to be really, really challenging. And we've alluded to that in terms of, fiscal stimulus, quantitative easing, all of that's out there at the moment. But where are we going to be in 6-12 months' time? We've got the largest economy in the world at the moment with 15% unemployment and rising. We are a long way away from, people get excited, and I'm excited of having a trans-Tasman bubble, but that's not going to be a solution for the major economies that we need to engage with. We're a small trading nation, locked down at the a remote part of the earth. So that's how a government meets the economic challenges ahead, which are astronomical and the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. That's the real test, and we'll see how we go.
Tim, just an extension question, just back to your opening comments, just around sector reputation and engagement with regulators and government. It feels in the New Zealand marketplace that there's almost been a sort of reset, that as the crisis hit, everyone's really come together to solve the pressing problem, and there's really only been one, and that's how do you get New Zealand, or I imagine Australia, how do you get Australia through the crisis? Just maybe paint a picture of whether you think there's been a reset in sector and regulator / government relations, and how effective has it been in your case for ICNZ to help drive some of the government thinking about the reset of regulatory timetables and so on?
Oh, you did right. There's nothing like being on a war footing where everybody has common purpose, and that's certainly been the case. And when you do have common purpose, whether you're regulators or the regulated, then you're all driving to support one another in terms of the outcomes. And I think that's been a sea change in the relationship. And I think if there's a silver lining out of this, it is that I think very much so that we've had a fundamental reset in relationships. Clearly, regulators will always be required to be independently monitoring us and our conduct, but I think we've demonstrated the ability to be able to meet the challenge in the worst possible situation. So that understanding is good, and that mutual recognition that, hey, we've got to let these guys get on and do what they need to do, and put that other stuff to one side, is great. I hope that will change the views that we had if we, wound back the clock 12, 15 months. And we looked at what was coming out of the Royal Commission findings and the review of the life and health sectors here. There was a huge question. Reputational damage was clear, left, right, and centre, because there was a public perception that there was something really fundamentally wrong with the financial sector. I think now what we're seeing is that there's the financial sector, together with the government assistance, that's going to pull us through this, and it's going to be a hell of a long haul. And I hope that resets public perceptions around the reputation of the sector, because there's certainly a very clear and evident commitment to help people through this.
Thanks, Tim. Phil, I'll go to you on your sense of that question in the Aussie market, and picking up Sally's earlier point. Has there been a shift at a political level? And I've got a couple of really interesting panel questions that have come through in the Q&A, which I'll go to you afterwards as well, Phil.
Look, there definitely has been, as Tim alluded to, and we've been talking about. I mean, this situation has given us the opportunity to reset, and for people to take a step back. We had the Royal Commission recommendations from our financial services, and like Tim was saying, the financial services reputation was battered and bruised, and we're already going through, from an advice perspective, significant regulation. And the government, due to the political forces, the government had already set itself a timetable for the implementation of a number of the recommendations, and that was a pretty tight time frame, and that was already going to have a significant strain, and is having a significant strain on the financial services sector, let alone financial advisors. what this has enabled us to do is everyone has taken a common sense approach, taken a step back, and the government has changed the timetable on a number of the recommendations, which has been a really good response, and give us some certainty around the fact that we need to deal with this crisis first, and ensure that we can actually continue to deliver to our customers, at the same time as implementing important reform to ensure that people have trust in the financial services sector, but at the same time have a realistic time frame. We've seen more than ever, I think, the government, the associations, I've worked closely with Sally and the FSC and other advisor associations, as well as ASIC, to look at some short-term measures that will help clients in the current environment, given that you can't see people face to face. So what do we do about wet signatures, paperwork for advisors, records of advice that need to be delivered within certain timeframes under the current law? We've seen a common sense approach from the regulator ASIC in changing in the short term some of the timeframes around those, and we continue the dialogue around there to ensure that we can actually continue to meet the needs of our clients at the same time as meeting the legal requirements within the restricted parameters we have around contact and talking to clients. So there's been more than ever a really good working together to address the short-term needs, but also look at the longer term and reset and say, okay, let's have a reasonable look at some of the timeframes on reform.
Phil, question from Kai, and this is an advice-focused question. How's the conversation shifted with customers as a result of COVID-19? And what are some of the discussions in the advice community that people are now having with customers?
It's a good question, Kai. I guess the conversations vary depending, like always with financial advice, it depends on the client's stage of life. A lot of clients in their retiree, pre-retiree phase wanting advice, just certainty around their strategy, their investment portfolio, what this current environment means for their portfolio. The word unprecedented has been used a number of times, and therefore that means, does that mean you can't predict how my investments are going? So there's a lot of conversations around what this means for my investments, my investment strategy. One of the areas that's been a big focus is short-term cash flow for clients who are paying insurance premiums. And this is something where there's been a lot of work. Tim alluded to insurance companies needing to remain solvent. We've had a significant change around our insurance portfolios, particularly around income protection over the last couple of years, to the extent that APRA, the regulator, has actually had to intervene to look at the design and pricing of products. So there's already been a strain on the insurance companies, and now we've had this wave of people saying, I can't pay my premium short term. And we're not just talking about small business. We're talking about ear, nose and throat specialists whose business has gone from hundreds of thousands of turnover to nothing overnight because they haven't been able to open their doors, and they've got significant insurance premiums. So the conversations advisors are having is how the insurers can help them through this short-term crisis. So it is varying, and then what we're seeing is how people are interacting. And we've seen a lot of advisors, as we're doing, adapt to using Zoom, FaceTime to talk to their clients. Some of it's been a difficult transition, and for others it's actually been liberating, and now we've got clients, particularly older clients who don't want to have to necessarily go into the city and see their advisor. They're quite happy to continue their reviews via Zoom in the future. So there's some of the positive things that are coming out of this, that people are having to adapt and actually find more efficient ways of doing things.
Phil, just an extension one to that. At law in Australia, there's the whole kind of client review process and opt-in and so on. Yep. Have you generally seen a lift in activity and productivity through COVID? Has there been as we've seen in hardship and super and other things, hugely spike at the institutional level? At the advice level, have you seen a similar kind of change with huge outgoing connectivity with client bases?
And that, what you've just said, the outgoing connectivity is probably the key point. The good advisors have been on the front foot, contacting their clients, keeping them informed and communicating to them. So the relief measures such as being able to access your super, they don't really apply to most advised clients because they've got an advisor who has a portfolio that's set up so that they've got enough cash to meet short-term needs. But certainly in terms of advisors engaging with their clients, the good ones are being more proactive. They're finding ways to communicate to their clients through webinars, through the Zoom meetings, through emails, and making sure that they actually are actually keeping their clients informed so as to avoid those reactive phone calls that a lot of the super funds, was mentioned earlier, those people who don't have advice, the super funds are inundated, and the ones I talk to, their call rates are higher than during the GFC. People wanting to know, is their super safe? Can they access it? How can they do that? And so it really, as I said earlier, it has emphasised the need for advice, but the cost of providing advice, as Vanessa pointed out, is increasing. So not everyone can afford to have that device.
Thanks, Phil. V, I'm going to come to you. Question from Murray around, you mentioned a little earlier the withdrawals out of superannuation funds. The systems are fundamentally different in terms of size and scale. And can you maybe just talk through, and the question specifically from Murray is, what are some of the longer term impacts that are going to happen at super savings and retirement, given the 10 plus 10, 10K plus 10K? And then Sally, I'm going to go to you on that insurance concordate discussion if I can.
Well, Murray's on the money. That's the big worry. I mean, the data's shown that 10 grand out of a 20-something-year-old super fund now could be $100,000 on retirement. So the opportunity cost of what it'll, taking the money now and not letting it sit there is enormous. The other side of the coin is Pandora's box is open now. Our super system has been, almost 30 years the pride of the nation. We've got the 4th largest savings pool in the world because of our superannuation system. And now people are able to get at it early. And I guess there's also the fear that if this has happened once, what if it's allowed to keep happening? What will happen to people's retirement savings and the purpose of the system? So that's twofold. And again, I mentioned Sally because she really pointed out to me, these people need this money. Like, there's no other option here. Some people just need this 10 grand now, and I see that. But it would be great if advisors had more capacity to do some modelling for people around what it will mean in the future. Because if people really understood at 40, if you take that 10 or 20 grand out, at 50, if you do it, what does it mean? Particularly at 20, maybe people would think differently. So again, that's an advice failing, really, according to Dante de Gore from the FBA, in the sense that advisors aren't really given the opportunity to comment. And, not everyone has an advisor. In fact, 3 out of 10 Australians have an advisor. So, it's a really concerning issue, but thank God we have that system, because now when people are suffering, it's at least a way for them to access cash.
I think that's right, yeah.
Sorry, Sally, you go.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. And I think a lot of the commentary around the destruction of people's superannuation funds has come from people who perhaps have never lost a job in their life or never been in financial distress. And I think, there are bubbles of our society where, people are not in that financial distress, but my goodness, the carnage for people who are is terrible. And I like what Minister Jane Hume says about this. She said, look, if you can't access that $10,000, what are you going to do? Sell your car? Not pay, critical bills, not be able to look after your children. So the point that the government has made is that this is people's money. If they need it desperately now, then they should have it. And I've been looking at some of the Facebook pages, particularly for young people, who so many of them have lost, every means of financial support. And these people are using the money to pay the bills. They're actually using it in the right way. There's a little bit of flare up about occasionally, people are gambling it or whatever. I think that's very, very small in number. I really do think that people are thinking very seriously before they do access that $10,000 this financial year, another $10,000 next financial year. But, you know, these are unprecedented times. We've always had the capacity in Australia to access super. If you are in critical financial need, you can do it. But this time we're seeing it on a much bigger scale.
I think this is a good example, Richard, of where we have seen common sense prevail and some good communication, because you know, the rules around being a licensed financial advisor are very strict. To call yourself a financial advisor and to actually give advice on certain areas. And so there's been a delineation between tax agents and financial advisors, but an allowance was made so that tax agents could actually give clients advice around access to super, because the more professionals that were able to help people make that decision, the better. So intuitively, as financial advisors, we would say that tax agents shouldn't be allowed to give advice on superannuation, which is normally the case. In this case, common sense needs to prevail, so the more professionals that can help people make that decision to ensure that they have exhausted all of their funds, they are making the right decision, because it is difficult to put money back into super. The more people helping people make those informed financial decisions, the better. So I think that's a good example of where common sense prevailed and we all recognise the need to be flexible.
Thanks for those comments, folks. We're at 10:43. We've got a couple of minutes to wrap the conversation. So I'm just going to go around to each of you. And Tim, if I start with you, I'll blend a couple of the questions that have come in. Do we think that our governments have got a plan to get us into the next 12 months? And perhaps the question is, if we're sitting here in this conversation in 12 months' time, where do we think we're at as a country and as a sector? And are there any tips for the people listening? Tim, I'll go to you first, Phil, and then Sally, and finally to V.
Well, we just had a budget a few days ago, which you know, has spelt out a very large sum of funding to take us through the next wee while, and there's a $20 billion more that has yet to be announced that will be out there. Where will we be in 12 months' time? Again, take the crystal ball, but it's really uncertain territory that we're in, and I think a lot of that will depend on other global economies. If you look at Europe, it doesn't look good. If you look at the States, it's not looking smart either. So that's what worries me. In 12 months' time, we will have, we'll be recovering from the trough of where we're at, but it'll be a long, slow recovery. This isn't going to be a 1-year turnaround. It's going to be multiple years. And, you know, we're operating in a very low interest environment. So investment returns, equities, all of that are very low. And at the same time, a trajectory for premium is going to be down as well. And that squeezes the insurer income, and that has consequences as well. So I think that will drive, actually, in a tighter environment, greater efficiencies, use of technology to create savings, and I think a more competitive offering to customers to keep them in. And so I think that might that will be a good feature that will come ahead. But I think there was a third part of the question.
No, that's good. That's great. Thank you, Tim.
I'll leave it there.
No, excellent stuff. Phil.
Look, I'll be very brief. I'll come back to where I started in the lens of the advisor. I think the positive to come out of the moment is much more communication and much more cooperation and dialogue within the financial services industry, and some common sense around some timeframes from advisors. We still will see, because of the weight of those things I talked about at the beginning, we'll still see an attrition of between 15-20% of advisors. But I do think the future will mean that in 12 months' time, we will start to, there will be a lot of challenges, there's no doubt, but we'll start to see an industry that's recognised as a profession, and people will have seen over the last 12 months the value of having financial advice, and it will become far more accepted as mainstream and increase the number of people that would seek advice. And I think I'd like to think the positive, and I think that's the positive to come out of the next 12 months.
Thanks, Phil. Sally?
Yeah, I agree with Phil. We're doing at the moment a very big piece of work called the Future of Advice, which actually started before COVID. This is going to be so pertinent when we come out of here, looking at different models. Some of those regulations that we've put on the shelf. Do we really need to go back to those if we're working so well at the moment and we're facilitating better customer experience? Do we really need to pull all those back from the shelf? I think that's going to be something that we have a real deep conversation with our regulators and government on. We have an October budget. So like Tim, we're expecting to hear a lot more from government because our May budget was basically deferred. We will have a long tail list of claims. Our life insurers are very worried about that. You've heard from Phil all the problems with life insurance in Australia. It's still, very dedicated life insurers, but that long tail, particularly of mental health claims, which have been soaring over the last 4-5 years. We had some data yesterday. We get great data from our insurers, and we have a partnership with KPMG, and we've seen massive increase in that number. So that's going to be, I think, a very scary thing to face into in the next 12 months. But look, I like to look at a little bit of glass half full. I'm hoping there are more opportunities for different businesses out there, particularly businesses that can access technology and all the lessons we've learned. I'm very frightened about a recession for my working age children. They have no concept. 30 years in Australia, absolutely no financial, no recessions. I've lived through 2 of them. They are extremely painful. But yeah, let's hope that our governments are sensible and there's a good path forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. And V, last word to you.
Well, I think from an advisor perspective, one thing we're going to see which is positive is the emergence of what we call wealth coaches. So there are sophisticated advisors for high net worths, but there is millions of people who need basic advice. Can it be done through technology? Yes. And is there a fair bit of psychology and mindset and education around that? Definitely. So I think, if I'm an advisor watching this, the opportunity is to start looking at how could I be a wealth coach to people and charge appropriately for that, perhaps with a whole online service, which could give people, a sense of peace. But most people need basic education around money. I mean, that's the reality. We're not taught it well in schools. Advisors have the answers. So the emergence of the wealth coach, I think, will be an important part of our recovery because there are not enough registered, sophisticated advisors to fill the need.
Thanks, V, and that's probably a lovely segue to do 2 things. Number one, huge thank you to the panel. Feels like we could go on to a number of other conversations. Consumer resilience is a big one. Reputation and trust of the sector is a huge one. Engagement with regulators is a huge one. We might look to see if we can do that another time. It is a segue also to the launch of the FSC New Zealand's Resilience Index, which we look out for the Herald on Monday, and we'll have a similar session like this on Tuesday afternoon. But the data coming through is exactly what you would expect. People are doing it tough already, and people will continue to do it tough. You'll hear a whole lot more about that on Tuesday and on Monday's Herald. But to thank the panel for your insight, for your very early morning start, for your willingness to engage, a huge thank you. And if I can do a virtual clap from Waiheke Island to wherever you are in the world, a massive thank you. Have a great afternoon and great weekend. Cheers. Bye for now.